Hello and welcome to today's Adaptation Platform webinar titled Understanding the Determinant Effective Policy Instruments for Climate Change Adaptation, Lessons from Ongoing Case Studies in Coastal Areas of Quebec, Atlantic Canada, and Massachusetts. My name is John Somerville and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada. Most of you are listening to the webinar directly through your computer speakers. However, if you run into any audio issues, you can call into the teleconference line. You can find the teleconference number and participant code in the top left corner under message from the host, or the webinar reminder email sent earlier today. For those of you who do dial into the teleconference line, your lines will be automatically muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A session for today's webinar, but don't hold your questions to the end. You can post them in the chat box to the left of your screen, and then we'll answer them during the Q&A period at the end of the presentation. Please feel free to type your questions in English or in French. Posez des questions dans la langue de votre choix. We are recording the webinar today, and we will be sending out a link to everyone who has registered. If you do run into any audio or technical issues during the webinar, please hover your mouse over Suzanne Thieling's name in the attendee list under Host and click on Start Private Chat. So today's webinar is brought to you by Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform Coastal Management Working Group. The Coastal Management Working Group consists of representatives from federal, provincial, and territorial governments, academia, as well as professional and other organizations working to advance adaptation and increase resilience to climate change along Canada's coasts. The Coastal Management Working Group is chaired by Natural Resources Canada and the Government of Prince Edward Island. The project presented today was funded with support from Natural Resources Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Program, under a 2017 call for proposals related to expanded or innovative policy instrument in coastal environments. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Nathalie Beaulieu is presenting on behalf of herself and Pierre Valois. She is a research professional at Université Laval within l'Observatoire québécois de l'adaptation au changement climatique. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees in civil engineering, as well as a doctorate in remote sensing, all from the Université de Sherbrooke. She did a postdoctoral fellowship in regional development with the Université du Québec à Rimouski. Her work currently focuses on public policies that promote adaptation to climate change. Pierre Valois is the project lead and has been a full professor in the Faculty of Education at University of Laval since 2000. His research focuses on issues related to climate change adaptation, changes in behavior, as well as the measurement of attitudes and beliefs. Several large-scale projects have been carried out under his leadership, including the one presented today. Manuel Nicolescu is a transportation planner at CVCL Limited in Halifax. He holds a BA in Geography and an MA in Urban Planning from the University of Toronto. In addition to transport planning, he contributes to several projects on adaptation to climate change, assessing the impact of climate change on different types of infrastructure. He also uses his training as a town planner to revise zoning bylaws and guidelines. David Zalewski is a PhD candidate in the Global Governance and Human Security Program at UMass Boston. He's currently working on research assistant with the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, researching climate adaptation policy and exploring policy pathways for advancing social equity and diversity and inclusion in New England's offshore wind energy. So on behalf of everyone joined today, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Nathalie, Manuel, and David for presenting today's webinar. It's much appreciated, and without further delay, we'll turn things over to Nathalie to start our presentation.
Hello everyone, and thanks a lot, John, for this introduction. Well, this project is also well, it's supported by Natural Resources Canada and also by two branches of the Quebec government, le Fonds de Recherche du Québec and the Climate Change Action Plan 2013-2020. And we're presenting on behalf of a larger team. The team, in addition to Pierre Valois, who's the lead, Lise Pueblo and I were research professionals at Ouranos, Caroline and Larrivée and Marianne Diop. In addition to Emmanuel, there's Léa Brasky and Vincent Leys at CBCL Limited, David Cash, Rebecca Hurst, Stacy Vandeveer, Patricio Bellois are working with David at UMass Boston, and Richard Palmer at University of Massachusetts Amherst. So we're working on 6 case studies, and the subjects are the following. We've got 2 in each region. In the province of Quebec, there's one on taking climate change adaptation into account in Montreal agglomeration's regional land use and development plan. So it's SAD for Schéma d'aménagement et développement. And we're also looking at environmental assessment of bank stabilization projects, mostly on the Côte-Nord region of Quebec. In Atlantic Canada, there are 2 case studies, both on the provincial support to municipal adaptation planning. And there's one in New Brunswick and the other one in Nova Scotia. And in Massachusetts, there's a study on the climate-ready Boston planning process, but also on the Commonwealth's Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. So it's a state program. So before we start on all this, what are policy instruments? What do we mean by that? Well, they're strategies or means that are used to advance the objectives of a policy. So they allow a policy agent, a government, either a local, regional, provincial or federal government, to act either directly or indirectly. And they can act directly through actions they do themselves, such as greening programs, the bank stabilization project, any infrastructure project. And to act indirectly, they influence the behavior of other actors by using information, community engagement plans, regulation, or funding, for example. So here we give more examples of instruments that can be used for climate change adaptation, and there are actually so many because climate change adaptation could be mainstreamed in just about anything that governments do. And at the municipal level, plans and programs can include strategic plans, adaptation plans, and land use plans, but any other plans such as economic development and infrastructure investment, etc. Land use bylaws, maps, consultative committees, asset management, tax incentives, those are all examples at the municipal level. And the provincial or state level can support municipalities with their grant programs, capacity building programs, websites and clearinghouses with climate indices, projections, impacts, etc., flood risk maps, regulations to protect coast watercourses and floodplains. So to guide our inquiry and also the analysis of results, we're using the theory of reasoned goal pursuit and we apply it to policy instruments. And this theory is useful because it allows us not only to look at how policy makers choose specific instruments, but also on how they influence the behavior of certain actors. So I'm going to use the pointer here to point to different bubbles. What this theory tells us is that a certain behavior, for example, here the use of a policy instrument, will result from an intention, and the intention will result from motivation. And in addition to motivation, we've got these control factors here that can hinder or can facilitate passing from motivation to intention to behavior and also to outcomes. these control factors, they include facilitating and constraint factors. They can affect how we go from one to the other, but they cannot in themselves generate an intention. So that's why the theory says that they have only a moderating effect. And our motivation in turn will be affected by our goals, but it will be mostly affected by our behavior, by our beliefs on how the behavior will help us advance our goals. So we consider that the motivation factors are the perceived advantages and disadvantages and perceived social pressure. So this theory gives us an interesting perspective because it also makes us reflect on what are the goals of the people we want to influence with policy instruments. So we apply this to multi-level governance, and actually by policy instruments, different levels of administration, different levels of government will try to influence each other and influence individuals and different sectors by influencing their motivation and control factors. So it's all related in a kind of a systems way. So our methodology after choosing the case studies, we started with a literature review and reviewing especially documents related to the policies we're studying. We did semi-structured interviews with key informants, and so the key informants are people who developed the policies and their instruments, but also there were people who were affected by them, and consultants who have contributed in supporting municipalities, for example. And so the interviews lasted on average an hour, and there were 3 to 7 interviewees per case studies, 13 in the MVP. So there was analysis by 2 judges, and now we're in the process of writing the case studies, collecting and integrating feedback on them. So we're going to present highlights from 3 case studies, starting with the one on Nova Scotia, so which will be presented by Emmanuel, and then David will present the case study on the MVP in Massachusetts, and then I'll be presenting a few slides on Montreal agglomerations, schéma d'aménagement et développement. So I'll pass the floor to Emmanuel. Thank you.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. On behalf of my colleagues, Léa and Vincent at CBCF, thank you very much, John and Nathalie, for the opportunity to participate in this study and for allowing me to present the Nova Scotia case study. So in Nova Scotia, we investigated specifically the climate change adaptation plan as it was conceived at the provincial level as a policy instrument in the context of climate change experience at the municipal level. We interviewed and spoke with Gordon Smith and Graham Fisher from the Nova Scotia Department of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Sean Andrews and Debbie Torrey from the Municipality of District of Guysborough, Dylan Hyde and Catherine Dory from the town of Mahone Bay, and Dr. Patricia Manuel from the School of Planning at Dalhousie University. So the Municipal Climate Change Adaptation Plan came as an outcome of the requirements under the 2005 and 2010 federal gas tax fund transfers for recipient municipalities to submit integrated community sustainable plans. Upon analysis of the about 50 or so plans that were submitted, climate change was found to be really a major recurring issue of concern for the municipalities. In response to these reported needs and the issues, the next tranche of the gas tax fund transfer in 2010-2014 was tied to municipalities submitting a municipal climate change adaptation plan identifying specific climate change needs and concrete actions. The motivator here for the province was the incitement of municipalities to formally consider climate change and to plan accordingly for their impacts. The clear benefit of such planning was to reduce the impacts of climate change, primarily in terms of flooding on coastal areas and their associated high costs of remediation and costs to well-being and quality of life. In parallel, social pressures came on one hand from municipalities experiencing the impacts of climate change directly, as serious storm surge, floods, and damage to critical infrastructure. More specific, really severe storms were experienced in 2016. Additional pressure came from emergency management agencies, which increasingly called for better risk prevention. Lastly, municipalities, through their MCAPs, reported lack of current flood mapping, limited legislative frameworks, and really unawareness or local knowledge of methodologies to address these concerns. Most immediate facilitating factors here came in the form of the province's control over the delivery of the gas tax fund and its requirements for reporting mechanisms. Municipalities often do not have the resources to maintain and to produce ongoing reporting, but they could produce an MCAP, and production of these plans were themselves funded under the gas tax fund agreement. Secondly, the province had better access to climate change projections and mapping resources. Under the Nova Scotia Municipal Act, municipal planning strategies include statements of provincial interests, which specifically address flood risks. And the province also controls legislation. It can lead several initiatives, such as acquiring up-to-date LiDAR survey data, and which ultimately allows for developing a really comprehensive digital elevation mapping of the entire province. These factors allow the province to extend really a number of sort of add-ons to the MCAP policy instrument. Using the Federal Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, the province acquired LiDAR data and undertook the Municipal Floodline Mapping Program, which set out a methodology to produce local flood maps using the new digital elevation models. These maps will ultimately be made available to the public, municipal agencies, reviewers, insurance firms, and so on. Secondly, the province legislated the Coastal Protection Act, which limits new development along sections of coastline most at risk of erosion and flooding. The Act sets out a methodology for erosion risk assessments, which are ultimately tied to municipal building permitting. Third, it made the production of municipal planning strategy documents mandatory, which weren't previously. These forced municipalities to consider the now public flood mapping and to really use them to conform to the Statement of Provincial Interest on flood risks. Lastly, it collaborated with a number of initiatives, such as the Atlantic Climate Adaptation Solutions Association, to develop the Coastal Community Adaptation Kit, and with the Nova Scotia Federation of Municipalities to include climate change and asset management plans. From a municipal standpoint, the primary motivator is really ensuring a good quality of life, safe mobility, access to clean air and water, and promoting prosperity for their residents. As experienced in the cases of the towns of Mahone Bay and the municipality of the District of Guysborough, these are increasingly threatened by climate change, requiring action to mitigate impacts. The advantage of acting within the MCAP policy instrument is that quite often addressing these impacts can be done in sort of the established planning frameworks. Municipalities, however, do feel social pressure from their constituents for the most affected by climate change impacts and by their mitigation actions. More recently, they're also affected by new requirements for asset management plans that are needed or will soon be really mandatory in order to access further federal funding opportunities. There is also very considerable pushback from affected landowners who often perceive a loss of control over their properties or loss of property value. This leads to questioning of the municipal effort, questioning their ability, and conflicts of interest. At the same time, there is often limited opportunity for mitigation and adaptation for some of the municipalities, particularly for the smaller towns, due to limited land areas and their jurisdictional boundaries. They simply cannot move assets, or they cannot extend across boundaries into the surrounding districts. Lastly, and until recently, there was often a lack of strategic planning mechanisms, so the planning documents really weren't there to allow even recognizing problems, let alone taking action. Facilitating factors are often felt at the local level. They include a really supportive council and staff that are well informed, they recognize the problem, and really are willing to act. Very often there's support from universities, from NGOs, groups, and various consultants that get involved. Ultimately, and very often, there's a need for a very vocal local champion that's willing to spearhead the action and really inform the constituents. Having existing revenue generating activities is also very helpful and can often partially fund, if not fully fund, actions. In our cases, in the cases of my own bay and Guysborough, both own stakes or outright own wind farms, which allows them, on one hand, to offset their energy cost, reduce their tax burdens, and also allocate some of these funds to adaptation and mitigation. Lastly, there's also the use of existing mechanisms such as transportation planning and wastewater management plans that can be used to address climate change impacts and incorporate mitigation or adaptation within the plans. The challenges and constraints for municipalities typically, not many surprises, but we're dealing with limited financial, technical, and human capacities. Often they have small budgets and the staff already wear multiple hats, limiting what they can do. There's a limited lack of access to mapping resources. And there's a certain effect due to the provincial funding structure where funding calculations are often based on population. So this leads to an imbalance between smaller towns with high budgetary responsibilities for infrastructure versus larger surrounding districts with larger populations but fewer responsibilities. So ultimately, in this case study, we do find that overcoming these challenges takes a really responsive, prepared team at a provincial level that can both recognize the needs, and the opportunities available. It's really identifying all the threads and tying them together. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll briefly present on the program, highlight some of the key factors that facilitate cities and towns using this policy, as well as a few challenges and how the program is working to improve this policy, which is now entering its 5th year. So how did the MVP program emerge? In 2016, the governor issued an executive order that called for integrating the Commonwealth's climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. This directive ordered the implementation of a Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or MVP, and the following year the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs launched the program, which is considered the flagship initiative to identify local vulnerabilities, build capacity at the local level, and inform the state's adaptation and mitigation plan with local, regional, and statewide data and input. When it came to the design of this policy, our research shows that environmental NGOs and climate justice NGOs, particularly the Nature Conservancy, among others, had significant input. One example being an emphasis on pursuing nature-based solutions and also addressing the concerns of environmental justice communities, which are 2 core principles of the MVP program. Our research shows that these 2 core principles influence how municipalities use this instrument to design their planning meetings and decide which actions to prioritize. Just a little bit about how the program works. Municipalities apply for a planning grant to conduct a standardized vulnerability assessment using the Community Resilience Building Framework as a guide, which is a community-driven process where participants identify top hazards, current strengths, challenges, and priority actions to improve community resilience for immediate as well as anticipated hazards. Upon completion of the planning process, municipalities then receive a designation as an MVP community, which makes them eligible to apply for an action grant to implement the project. The designation, we can say, provides a strong incentive to cities and towns because it unlocks a new stream of funding to support adaptation and resiliency projects. The MVP program also created a vendor system as a way of standardizing the planning process across the state. vendors, and there's about 363 of them today, range from private consultants to engineering firms, from environmental groups and watershed associations to experts in community facilitation. Vendors also make climate data maps and projections that have been compiled by the Massachusetts Climate Change Clearinghouse available to participants in the planning meetings. So taken together, the grants, the vendor system, planning framework, and maps and data can be considered facilitating factors at the municipal level for utilizing this policy instrument. And as of last year, 82% of cities and towns across the state received the MVP community designation, and about 36% have received an action grant. And overall, about $33 million US dollars have been awarded in planning and action grants, and the average action grant amount in fiscal year 2020 was around $195,000 US dollars. So overall, research participants, those we interviewed, regard the MVP program as a very useful policy for implementing adaptation policies at the municipal level. However, as with any policy, concerns and challenges were raised. Research participants in one city who were in the MVP planning process voiced concerns with the limitation of the workshop format and strict adherence to the community resilience building framework, while acknowledging the value of having a standardized format and a shorter time frame of 1 to 2 days to be respectful of participants' limited availability. Some are concerned that the format may inadvertently limit public input into the planning process. So organized groups that are more likely to show up and drive the process, whereas less organized groups may face barriers to participation, though they may be no less impacted, if not more so, by the climate crisis. Some participants observed a lack of representation of low-income immigrants, non-English speakers, and persons with disabilities at some of the planning meetings. In another town, however, the vendor hired to run the workshop extended their services beyond the planning workshop to conduct sustained outreach and focus groups with members of environmental justice communities as a way of generating further community input. The diversity of vendor types, as I mentioned earlier, seems to suggest that they bring different expertise, skills, and approaches to the planning process. There are, of course, trade-offs to every approach, and a municipality's resources may be a factor in how it goes about planning for adaptation. One city official informed us that the value of the MVP workshop is that it convenes community members to discuss and raise awareness about climate change, although they tend to be far less technical and expert-driven than a formal vulnerability assessment, which is also costlier. Based on participant observation in 2 towns' planning meetings and a review of random sampling of planning reports, towns tend to identify a myriad of priorities, which for us is raising more questions about how do municipalities decide which action to prioritize? How do the planning processes and vendor systems shape policy outcomes at the municipal level? And what factors shape decision making? One case study I conducted of a densely populated city seems to reveal that they selected a priority over equally compelling and urgent ones based on the extent to which it met the core principles of the MVP program, even if some of the core principles, such as nature-based solutions, were not perceived to be the most effective approach to adaptation in a city that is highly urbanized. So it's sort of, to put it short and briefly, it's the it seems the extent to which towns will prioritize one action over another to the extent that it fits the requirements of this particular policy. And for this final slide, some challenges for the MVP program are the lack of regional governance structures, which pose a barrier to adapting to climate change. A state senator we interviewed put it succinctly by saying that municipalities are not equipped to tackle the regional impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise. The lack of regional governance structures constrain the state's capacity to coordinate multi-city adaptation efforts. And furthermore, the home rule provision, which is intended to enhance self-governance for cities and towns, was cited by some regional watershed associations as an obstacle to pursuing regional resilience. And municipal officials we interviewed also recognized that the impacts of climate change do not respect city limits. One said that renovating culverts in one town will work only in the short term as long as neighboring towns do not address the flood capacity of their culverts. More recent cycles of the MVP program, however, encourage municipalities to work together on a shared project, but this also poses challenges to coordination. And in some cases, watershed associations use the MVP policy as a vehicle to propose a multi-city project to towns within a watershed, and then will serve as the MVP vendor to drive the planning process. The MVP program also has 6 regional coordinators who work closely with city and town officials to try and encourage multi-municipal projects where possible. And a final challenge I just want to highlight that emerged from the research is how can a policy build resiliency and adaptation while also addressing existing issues of environmental inequities and injustices. Initial findings seem to show that the MVP program is actively engaged in ongoing learning and refining approaches to address environmental justice from both top-down and bottom-up input. Municipal level actors, concerned citizens groups, and MVP program staff interact regularly to further develop climate adaptation approaches that foster the agency and participation of historically marginalized populations. And from the top down, the state's Director of Environmental Justice has been recently strengthening environmental justice concerns in the MVP program, namely by including environmental justice sensitivity into the request for response language. All planning grant applicants therefore must include a public involvement and community outreach plan to environmental justice communities in their proposals. So to conclude this case study, overall the merits of the program is that it provides municipalities with the resources, technical assistance, and frameworks for developing and pursuing climate adaptation projects. And the program also serves as an important conduit through which municipalities and the state can exchange best practices and approaches to adaptation and resilience. Thank you.
Okay, so it's my turn again, and I will talk to you about considering adaptation in Montreal agglomeration's land use and development plan, the Schéma d'aménagement et de développement (SAD), and we're interested in presenting this study because it also gives insight on how to use regional planning to advance adaptation goals, and the need for regional planning was addressed in many other case studies in other regions. So the agglomeration groups the city of Montreal and a number of other municipalities on the island of Montreal. So the section on climate change adaptation is in the chapter on improving quality of life, and it aims to increase greening, reduce heat islands, reduce stormwater quantity, and increase its quality. The SAD also sets a target for protecting 10% of terrestrial areas, and so these protected areas and parks contribute to the other objectives mentioned earlier. And Montreal's revised SAD is in force since April 2015. And so the perceived benefits for considering adaptation in the SAD, well, there was a focus on greening because of all of the social and environmental benefits of vegetation, in addition to reducing the heat island effect and also intercepting and infiltrating rainwater. It also has many effects on the quality of life of the people living in the city. Parks and protected areas also have multiple benefits: to control development in areas at risk, give access to shores and to retain stormwater, And the way the SAD has policy influence is by influencing the local bylaws through conformity mechanisms. So the inclusion of climate adaptation is not mandatory. It's not mandatory to include climate change adaptation in the planning instruments. And the SAD is the regional level of a series of planning instruments under the Provincial Act respecting land use planning and development, la loi sur l'aménagement et l'urbanisme. So this law has a series of conformity mechanisms. So the regional level has to be compliant with the metropolitan level, and the metropolitan level and all levels have to be compliant with the provincial level orientations. And so because the metropolitan plan, the PMAD, came in force in 2012, that triggered the need to review, to update the SAD, and it was reviewed by 2015. So that was a social pressure that triggered the review of the SAD, and it was an opportunity to include climate change adaptation. The Public Health Agency was also advocating for greening in response to extreme heat and air quality issues, and there were many environmental groups advocating for conservation and access to shores. The revision of the SAD includes consultation processes, so there were many environmental groups participated in the consultation processes. The City of Montreal is also engaged in a number of different international programs, such as the C40, 100 Resilient Cities. The Mayor of Montreal is ambassador of biodiversity with ICLE. So there are a number of programs there where Montreal has taken engagements and wants to show that it's making progress in its commitments. Facilitators include the fact that the adaptation section was developed by municipal planning staff with a multi-service working group and an expert committee. And many sections of Montreal's public administration have environmental goals. For example, in developing the case study, we've worked with the Office of Environmental Transition and Resilience. There's a park service that has a division for urban biodiversity. There's an environmental section, an environmental service, and there's the water service. And all of these are contributing to reaching the goals that are set in the SAD. There was also the availability of climate projections that helped. There were heat island maps provided by UQAM. Also, something very important is that innovative boroughs, well, the City of Montreal is composed of a number of boroughs, arrondissements, who have their own bylaws, and some of them, mostly Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie, was the first to develop provisions in its bylaws to reduce heat islands. And so that provided a proof of concept and an example that on which the agglomeration based itself to make these provisions mandatory in all the boroughs or the municipalities where there is a risk of heat islands. Also, the water service of the City of Montreal updated the city's environmental regulations to improve stormwater management, so that also contributed to achieving the SAD's goals. And like as everywhere, there are challenges, and one of them was the limited knowledge about the performance of possible adaptation options and their costs. So it was impossible to make things mandatory when you're not sure how well they will work and what the implications will be. There were tight deadlines, and that limited the number of public consultations, and there have been court cases, there continue to be, with developers or landowners suing the local government or the City of Montreal for restricting their activities. So these legal procedures discourage local governments, but also the agglomeration, to put very restrictive provisions. And sometimes it's just, the fear of having unpopular provisions that can discourage municipalities and regions to have bold provisions for adaptation. Of course, there are limited budgets of local governments to acquire land and to ensure the maintenance of vegetated areas. So that limits how adaptation can be can come into action. So now we're going to draw some lessons across the 6 case studies, and we found that, well, there were factors that came up everywhere, regardless of location and in all of the administrative levels, and motivating factors were divided by perceived advantages and perceived social pressures. The perceived advantages include favoring sustainable development, quality of life, and reducing risks for civil security, real estate, and infrastructure. The social pressures come from requests or expectation of the constituency, requests from the authorities of level above, previous engagements or commitments, accountability to funding agencies. That's also another type of pressure. And here we listed a few common facilitating factors that, if they're not there, it becomes a constraint. The human resources are very important. We met lots of competent and motivated people who really overcome the obstacles that come their way. The availability of experts is really important, from the experts from the academic sectors, consultants, NGOs as well. Availability of funds, availability of information, involvement of members of the constituency, that makes a big difference. But one thing that we found was really important is this concept called boundary work, which is the capacity or the work of mediating between different members of the constituency, what experts say, what available information says, and mediating between the different interests, between the different strings that are being pulled to make decisions that are in the benefit of the community, of collective interests. So this was something important within the policy, within the authorities. So there were common issues, there are challenges with consultation and engagement, as David mentioned. Sometimes, this has come up just about everywhere in different forms. Sometimes it's logistic problems or time constraints. In bigger cities, engaging people is more complicated. It's a more complicated process. But even in smaller places, sometimes there's conflict or polarization in town, within the constituency, and it can be difficult to develop consultation meetings and not having opposition. So that discourages fluid consultation. And even sometimes when it works really well and you've got a really good group of people who participate and you've got an ongoing process, sometimes it's always the same people who participate and other are either left out or they just don't come. So we have to find a way to reach out to those people, especially the people who are most at risk and the most vulnerable. There's also the we realized sometimes we come to a point where there's a necessity to limit the freedom of some groups, to limit the risks to them and to society in general. And it's important to set standards that can increase the fairness and acceptability of these limitations, but that involves responsibilities and costs, and nobody wants to be the bad guy who limits what people can do on their land, or and so that's why sometimes there's responsibilities or maybe sometimes not taken, and there are also costs, opportunity costs, and often there's the question: are these costs going to be bared only by the people who are concerned, who are in the areas at risk, who have land or who live there, or is the cost going to be shared more largely by society? So our preliminary conclusions are that instrument effectiveness depends, among other things, on the capacity of the authorities to combine different types of intervention towards collective and long-term benefits, and it includes their capacity to respond to constraints faced by them and also by those they seek to influence. So that involves having adequate feedback and also having adequate consultation. We found that the results of scientific research are used in many processes in planning, engagement, decision-making processes, and they influence motivation and control factors. Advancing goals related to sustainable development and quality of life, that contributes to the motivation of authorities and to their will to overcome constraints. So when a project can get people excited about, a new beach or a bicycle path or active transportation, that really gets people motivated. So our next steps in the project is we're gonna hold some virtual workshops in the context of each case study in February, and we're aiming to have the drafts of the case study chapters briefs and the PowerPoint presentations available in early March, and the final versions available at the end of the project. So if you'd be interested in giving us feedback on some drafts or in participating in our discussions, you can contact us. Our email addresses are below. Here we give you the cited references of the theoretical frameworks and the definitions that we use, but we've referred to many documents in each case studies, and you'll be able to consult those when they're ready. And we thank you for your attention, and thanks so much to the participants in the case studies. And to reach us, you have our email addresses again. And so I turn the floor to John for the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. That's excellent. What a great presentation, and thanks to Emmanuel and David for presenting as well. We will turn to our question and answer period, and I'll remind folks that the slides were shared today. So if you want to follow up with the individuals later, their contact details will be in those slides as well. Our first question is, any thoughts about the legal responsibility of municipalities to take climate change into consideration?
Yeah, maybe I'll put my thoughts to that. Increasingly, municipalities are being challenged in cases where extreme floods do occur, and there have been numerous cases quite recently in recent years where quite a lot of affected landowners and new home buyers have been very heavily affected by storms, by floods, and they turned around and have been asking, well, what is the city's responsibility, having allowed development in these areas that are now at risk of flooding? It's a difficult question with regards to the liability. Often cities can just turn around and say, well, we did not have recent enough or accurate or up-to-date flood mapping, so this has been a bit of a surprise. So a lot of municipalities, particularly in the Nova Scotia context, do include measures within both their planning documents and their bylaws, trying to curb development in areas that are seen as being at risk. There are the statements of provincial interest with regards to flooding, floodways and flood fringe that identify those areas where mapping is available. That will increasingly be the case from now on. There's also prescriptive minimum elevations for new buildings in certain areas, and that's where the flood mapping really is coming in very useful, because now municipalities can identify the areas at risk. They can identify the minimum elevations and then work that into their documents. So that's definitely something we'll be seeing more of as municipalities try to take responsibility for at least mitigating the impacts of climate change.
Thanks, Emmanuel. And then we have another question here on the need for regional collaboration and regulatory frameworks. Do you have insights into what sort of form ideal these collaboration networks would take? Could watershed-based governance help respond to these needs?
I'll just add briefly to that. I think I mentioned that one of the challenges is in the context of Massachusetts, there is this lack of regional governance, and some of these watershed associations, they don't have regulatory power, so they sort of occupy this informal space between the municipal and the state level, and they're mainly NGOs, but they have a lot of expertise and are sort of thinking and acting from more of like a watershed perspective. And so I think it was interesting to see, at least with the MVP program, how they would utilize a policy in which only municipalities, sort of would have authority. They were the ones who sort of can make the decision to pursue this policy and apply, essentially apply for grants and manage grants that these regional or these watershed associations would take on the role of a vendor and would take that initiative to engage with municipalities to even inform them that this kind of program even exists, and use that as a way of coordinating between towns in a watershed and using this particular policy to do a vulnerability assessment and come up with an action plan that was regional in scope. So that's sort of what's being done with that regard. I'll stop there.
Thanks, David.
I'll add to the region. Yes. Well, here in Quebec, we have I'm a big fan of these regional plans because they're not only land use plans, but they're really kind of a strategic development and land use plans, and they involve extensive consultation and have they develop a long-term vision, and they're also tools that regional municipalities can use to plan, for example, if there had to be migration in the future, that's the tool to use to decide which parts will we think that could be developed in the future in case there would be disasters and people would have to move, or where we could develop new neighborhoods. So the regional planning that we have in Quebec, I find is quite good. It's a very good tool for adaptation. That's my opinion.
And Deborah has a great question. Have you seen any tensions related to timeframes for certain planning documents that may have shorter time horizons relative to longer term impact, like sea level rise?
We might have seen some tension. I don't think in the projects that at least CBCL has been involved. I'm not sure tension related to the time frame came up so much as questioning the mapping, the flood line, sometimes questioning the methodology or the inputs to the process and to the studies. Typically we provide a number of, or we calculate or model a number of different scenarios and with different return periods, and we can take it up to 50 years or beyond, and always those always back up to the most recent sea level rise projections. So I don't think we've seen too much challenge on the timelines of these.
Thanks. I think Nancy's comment is responding to the last question. One of the most fraught adaptation measures is retreat or relocating from hazardous areas. Have you seen any forms of retreat in the case studies you examined? And I guess how were those decisions taken, and what were the outcomes?
In the case study on, we don't have any case studies specifically on retreat or migration, but in the one on environmental assessment of bank stabilization projects on the north coast on Côte-Nord in Quebec, we've interviewed the Ministry of Transportation, and they've had to change, they've had to dislocate the road in different places, and of course there's a very big opposition. There's a lot of resistance to changing the road because